Asian. I am Keith Chow. I am so excited for this episode. I am joined by chef, entrepreneur, restaurateur, activist. He is the co-owner of Lucky Danger in DC and various other ventures. He's also the founder of Chefs Stopping AAPI Hate. Please welcome to Southern Fried Asian, Chef Tim Ma.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I've been excited for this for a while because I feel like I have a kinship with you since we're both Chinese Americans of a similar age, growing up in the South, who have an appreciation for American Chinese food, I would say.
Oh, for sure. So much so that I have an American Chinese takeout now.
I know, and that's one of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you. But we'll get to Lucky Danger in a minute. I wanted to first welcome you and ask you about one part of your backstory that I don't know that a lot of people know about, is that you were born and raised in rural Arkansas. And I guess the question is, how did your family end up in Arkansas?
Yeah, so it's interesting in that, that part of it's a bigger part of my narrative these days. And it was one of those things that I tried to run away from it in my younger years. And now it's just become such a big part of and trying to embrace that part of my narrative now. And so, yeah, I was born in Arkansas in the 70s, which wasn't the best time to be born in Arkansas as an Asian American. But my parents ended up there as, they were coming to America. My parents actually met at the University of Arkansas. It's not like they got married in China and then came over here together.
Right.
They came separately as immigrants. My uncle, my dad's sister's husband, was a professor at the University of Arkansas. And my dad came over here because he was getting in trouble in Taiwan. So they're like, go to America. And
it's the Bruce Lee story, basically, right?
If my dad was Bruce Lee, that would be amazing. Sometimes he probably thinks he is Bruce Lee. But yeah, he ended up in Arkansas with my aunt, went to school there. My mom was a student there, but also a student professor in German, of all things. My mom's very talented at languages, whereas I am not. And so one of her mentors was my uncle. And so that was just natural that they got introduced. So that's how we ended up there back in the 70s. But like I said, it was like many Asian Americans that were probably born in the South in the 70s and 80s. There were a lot of different pockets of racism that for sure that we experienced.
I like what you said, that you used to kind of run away from and you've recently embraced it. I mean, I kind of feel the same way. That's what prompted this podcast, is just kind of an understanding that these are experiences that shaped who we were, and that also finding community in other Asian Americans who had similar life experiences, because I think primarily the narrative of Asian America does not extend to the South, right? It's usually Chinatown, San Francisco, coastal. Yeah. And then the fact that there are folks like us who grew up in rural parts of the country, it's almost like a mind fuck, right? It's what? You were where? Because I similarly grew up in a rural part of Virginia. When I tell people I'm from Virginia, you're there now, you're like, oh yeah, Arlington, Annandale, what the fuck? But I grew up in Luray, which was probably a little bit closer to your experience growing up in Arkansas, which is this small town in the middle of the mountains. There were pockets of racism I felt, but it was also we're of the same age. We grew up in the 70s and 80s. That the nostalgia of that time period is deep in our bones, just kind of engineered that way, right? The 80s were specifically engineered to be nostalgic.
Yeah.
So that experience of being in Arkansas, being in the rural part, I know that I've read stories of finding bricks being thrown through your window. Your family didn't run a restaurant in Arkansas, did they?
They eventually did, but that wasn't how it started. But yeah, my parents ended up opening a restaurant, and many just immigrants in general, not just Asian American immigrants, but they found a way to live by doing just what they know. And, cooking food and running food businesses, whether it's a grocery store, a restaurant, or a takeout, were very easy entrances into
they were available.
Yeah, it was very easy to break into that, because food is a very easy introduction into another's culture. And so, yeah, my parents ended up opening a restaurant.
Because that to me is an interesting transition, right? Because as you said, your parents came to America to go to university. They're professors. They were, I guess, were they studying engineering? Or was the engineering your pathway that you kind of abandoned halfway through?
Yeah, my dad did biomedical engineering, and then my mom was a master's in German.
Yeah, which is wild. But yeah. So that, similarly, my family came to America, and it was I don't know that they came specifically to run a restaurant, but that ultimately is what happened. How did your family transition from being academics to Chinese American chefs?
Yeah, it was very tough. My dad was working in the hospital as a med tech, but also like my parents opened this restaurant, and the restaurant did very well. But running a restaurant is, very simple in nature, but it tends to be a little bit more complicated in like the front and back of the house. And so they had a fantastic Chinese chef that just like, ran a very good restaurant, cooked very good food, and it became very popular in Arkansas. And then, success changes people sometimes. And so the chef saw that the success of my parents' restaurant and opened the second Chinese restaurant across the street and kind of decimated my parents' restaurant just because neither of them were chefs, right? They knew how to run a professional kitchen, where running a professional kitchen and cooking in a professional kitchen is a completely different thing from home cooking, right?
Right.
And so they do know how to cook at home very well, but like translating that is like two different languages. And so that, and really the nail in the coffin for my parents was like a drunk driver, just like, with his big redneck pickup truck, just like ran through the entire restaurant one night when he
Whoa.
And so really? Like that just kind of like was like my parents like, okay, this is the third boat from God. We need to get out of this business.
So they got out of the restaurant business after how long were they running the restaurant?
They fixed the restaurant back up, reopened it, and then they're like, this is not for us. And so they sold the restaurant to one of the other chefs that came in and took over. Mm-hmm. And that chef actually ran that restaurant for 30 years.
Well, how long were they in the business?
They were only in the business for like two years or something.
Okay. And how old were you at that time?
I was very young. And so like my memory of things in Arkansas is very like spotty, right? Like how much do you remember before you were like 7 years old, right? Mm-hmm. So I only remember specific moments, not really the entire story. And so like even like the truck running through the restaurant, I only heard about it.
Right. It's more of a myth than an actual like memory.
Right. But yeah, that chef, when I opened my first restaurant in like 2009, I think my parents went to Arkansas and like went to visit this guy who was still running the restaurant to that day, which was, it goes to show you like the longevity of Chinese restaurants. In America.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, because the reason I ask is I was wondering if that's where like the bug started, but I guess not, because once they got rid of the business, it wasn't like, my story, my brothers, where we were like growing up in the restaurant, right? Like my brother was like 9 years old at the cash register. I was like a 12-year-old, bussing tables or washing dishes.
Yeah, no, not like that.
But because Chinese food is also like in your extended family. Your uncle famously had a restaurant in New York, and his food was enshrined in the Smithsonian a couple years ago. So like the Chinese restaurant business is somehow part of the family, even if it wasn't a direct part of your family growing up.
Yeah. And it surrounded me, but I was actually me and my sister were the only cousins of the large cousin group that we have that actually did not work in the restaurants. And so, I didn't grow up in it. And, infamously or famously, or whatever you want to say, like I didn't really know how to cook till I was like 30 years old. So until I went to culinary school. And part of why I went to culinary school is because of this story, and that like my parents got upheld by a chef. They had no idea how to do professional cooking. So when I ultimately decided to open a restaurant, I was like, I at least need to know how to cook in case my chef walks out on me. And that's why I ended up cooking, though I didn't pick up a knife till I was 30.
Yeah, no, and that's an amazing part of the story too, because when you trained too, you trained in French technique, right? That was your...
And that could be, could be whatever you want to call it, quote unquote, childhood trauma, right? Just having restaurants all around me, seeing how hard of a life that actually was.
Yeah.
Was like, okay, maybe like Chinese restaurants isn't for me just because of how, how they existed in the 70s and 80s. But so I went off to be French trained because that was what was of no...
I mean, that's what you expected, right? When you're going to be a chef, you got to learn French technique. That's just kind of the stereotype, I guess.
Well, there's no Chinese cooking school, which is, ding, 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 kind of like one of the business ideas is, hey, nobody goes and be like, oh, come do Chinese cooking school. And there's just a bunch of woks and cleavers and stuff like that. It's all... French knives and French technique everywhere. That's the only culinary schools that exist.
But then when you branched out and opened restaurants, a lot of your restaurants in the past kind of blended those worlds, right? Like you had the Asian background, but also like the the French technique in a lot of your restaurants before you dive like head first into like, things like Lao Ban or Lucky Danger.
Yeah, it's hard to avoid, right? So you do what's familiar to you and what you've seen throughout your life. And so as I started cooking and running restaurants, it was hard to avoid bringing that influence into what I was doing. And then I will say that like everybody has many midlife crises in their lives. I had multiple. One of them was transitioning from engineering to cooking. And then not the second one, but this gradual one of going from, French fine dining cooking, and over time started to bleed into like, oh, I want to explore more of my heritage. Mm-hmm. And that could go hand in hand with, my parents' generation getting older. And this is probably true for many Asian Americans in that, now that we are quote unquote American, we're starting to like every child in the next generation is mixed. Nobody's pure Chinese anymore in my family. Mm-hmm. And so I am going back towards my parents' generation now and exploring like the culture and of course our history around restaurants and food, just because that will be lost with them. And so I want to make sure that we, for one, honor it, do our best to preserve what was important, and then push it forward.
Southern Fried Asian is being sponsored by Athletic Greens. I want to talk to you about Athletic Greens. With one delicious scoop of AG1, you're absorbing 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day right. This special blend of ingredients supports your gut health, your nervous system, your immune system, your energy, recovery, focus, and aging. Basically all the things. One of the best things about Athletic Greens is that it's lifestyle friendly, whether you eat keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free. It also contains less than 1 gram of sugar and no GMOs, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything, and it still tastes good. Athletic Greens uses the best of the best products based on the latest science with constant product iterations and third-party testing. Right now, it's time to reclaim your health and arm your immune system with convenient daily nutrition. It's just 1 scoop in a cup of water every day, that's it. No need for a million different pills or supplements to look out for your health. And to make it easy, Athletic Greens is partnering with Hard Knock Media to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/emerging. That's athleticgreens.com/emerging to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. I love the idea of like honoring and preserving particularly American Chinese food, because this is my high horse, and this is why I was so excited to talk to you and especially explore like your philosophy with places like Lucky Danger. And it's this idea of authenticity, right? Like that gets bandied about a lot, especially in our community, primarily I think in the Asian American community, where there's a lot of like clowning of quote unquote not real Chinese food. And as I said, I think before we started recording, I talked to you about this a little bit, about my personal beef with that thinking, because the comeback I always have is like, well, that was authentic to me, right? Like that's what my family, for nearly 40 years was breaking their backs to put out. Like it almost diminishes or dismisses like what a Chinese chef does when people kind of assume like, well, that's just Chinese food for white people, right? That's not the real Chinese food. And I wanted to like get your take on, especially this venture you're doing about Lucky Danger, where you're kind of preserving but also moving forward, particularly American Chinese food.
Yeah. I draw a line and say that American Chinese food and Chinese food are 2 different things.
Sure.
And you can maybe the definition is American Chinese food and Chinese food in America are 2 separate categories of cuisine.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I mean, I get a lot of that to this day. And the dishes like General Tso's and like Kung Pao all have origination in true Chinese dishes, in China. It was just they came over here with the immigrants and got modified because they figured out, hey, look, like I can make money off my cuisine by opening these restaurants, but the only thing I got to do is like modify it for the American palate, which is completely separate. Like just in general, culturally, we're just like so different between China and America.
And also availability of ingredients, right? Like when you're coming over here in the 1870s, it's not like there's bok choy growing in
Yeah, that's a great point. Like Sichuan peppercorns were like such a change when they became like legal, right? It was like legal for a while just in terms of having Sichuan peppercorns. And then, quote unquote the authentic Chinese food in America is still probably like very Americanized in terms of what it actually is in China. And it's been fun, I will say, like doing that exploration and seeing it real time now that like, you know, people don't really recognize it as like a restaurant from like a chef or like my brand as a chef. They just see it as like a Chinese takeout that has like cool fun stuff. And so of course, you know, I get a lot of questions on, you know, oh, this isn't authentic Chinese food. And I was like, it's not meant to be, blah, blah, blah. But the fun exploration has been, okay, American Chinese food is this way because they took true Chinese dishes and modified them, or, you know, like crab rangoon has no origination. And
Right.
really, it was just something that got created here. And really, the basis is probably more Southeast Asian than it is East Asian.
I mean, rangoon got nothing to do with China, right?
Yeah, like cream cheese. Like
cream cheese, right?
And so we kind of took the perspective in honoring these American Chinese classics like General Tso's and like In the Way, and trying to like bring them up to date, but you can only do that so far, but like bring them up to date in terms of like the ingredients that we use or like the techniques and process that we use. But for the most part, they're mainly roughly the same that they've been for like 40 or 50 years. But how do we take Chinese food in America, and like more traditional dishes that you see in true quote unquote Chinese restaurants in America, and start to move them into the Chinese American diaspora, right? And so like, could we take dishes like pork belly with mustard greens and make that more of an American Chinese dish? And so that's been kind of a fun exploration. And like, you know, we do have to modify some of these dishes. And when I say modify, typically it's more sugar, more MSG.
Right.
It's a little bit sweeter, and that's just what the American palate is. But I'll say the American palate is changing as well, right?
Right.
And so it's what I'll say a fun challenge. Typically, when I say fun, it comes in terms of like harsh criticism on the internet. That has been really kind of where we want Lucky Danger. And before, when I said like preserving and honoring, is preserving and honoring what that is and pushing it forward in terms of like introducing or reintroducing more sophisticated Chinese dishes to the more sophisticated American palate that we're seeing.
You know, you have to at least come from a place of respect, right? Because that's the thing that when I hear people joke about American Chinese food, or, you know, Andrew Zimmern famously a couple years ago called it like horseshit Chinese food, right? And then got blowback by the same Chinese American or Asian American people who also clown Asian American food.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, it's got to be one or the other. You can't like complain about white people complaining about horseshit Chinese food and also call it horseshit if you don't respect the origins of that cuisine, right? Because, you know, especially as Asian Americans, because I always think that like American Chinese food is such a emblematic of the Asian American experience, because isn't our existence all about taking what was originally Chinese and adapting it to being an American and fully owning our Americanness and our Asianness, right? Because yes, like General Tso's chicken is too American for Asia, but like Tim Ma and Keith Chow are too American for Asia.
Yeah.
But it's also too Asian for America, just like Tim Ma and Keith Chow. We are too Asian for America. And that's why like American Chinese food, more than any other cuisine, is like such a perfect embodiment of that experience.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting in that, like, you know, American Chinese food is as American as like pizza and burgers, right? It's like
absolutely
probably like outside of like Uber Eats, the number one takeout food in America, and people love it. And so, you know, I'm trying to embrace that more and more and being like, okay, like using it as a tool, like this is outside of the business perspective of it, but like using it as a tool to like spark the conversation around the culture. And sometimes that works and sometimes that falls flat on its face. But like, you know, we hopefully get some points for trying the attempt.
Yeah. You know, I think there is more of an embrace, because I think there was a New York Times piece that highlighted other chefs around the country who are also similarly doing this kind of reclamation of American China. And that's what I've always wanted, right? Because I've always just wanted people to acknowledge, yes, you know, this is quote unquote not real Chinese food, but it is real to someone. It's still real food. You know, and there are places that do it better than others. And there is examples, yes, of horseshit food, but that's any cuisine. Like you can do it poorly, but at least acknowledging its origin and its history as a legitimate cuisine, I think is important.
I think we're having a moment. I think like, you know, the pandemic for sure, like helped. I will say like one of the good things is like sparked this moment. In terms of like, you know, of course, very bad things had to happen. And that's typical of like, quote unquote, having these moments and like all the anti-Asian sentiment that was happening. But then you saw the country rally behind this moment in terms of like, okay, those incidents were terrible, but now let's bring this to the front of the conversation. Like, this has been happening for years. You experienced it. I experienced it in terms of like, you know, racism towards Asian Americans. It was just like pushed under the rug. And now that it's to the forefront, it's a good moment to start talking about it. And most people, or not most people, I'll say there's a lot of people that the furthest thing that they know about Chinese culture is through American Chinese food. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, like that New York Times article, like there are certain people who are whatever it could be called, like a renaissance of American Chinese restaurants. And I think that's because the old Chinese restaurants that serve American Chinese food are dying, mm-hmm. right? Like they're falling off, and that's sad because it's such an ingrained part of American culture. And especially when you start to talk about the history of food in America, Chinese food plays a big part of that.
For hundreds of years, right?
Yeah.
And like the only thing that there are more of than like Chinese restaurants in the country were like McDonald's. And the thing too is that like no matter where you are, like rural Arkansas, rural Virginia, the middle of nowhere, like there's always a Chinese restaurant. It doesn't matter how small the town is, how minimal the population is. There's a Chinese spot somewhere in this country. And that's, you know, that's amazing at the same time that it's also, you know, a period we're living through. And this was actually a great segue to talking about your advocacy work as well as your culinary work. And you did found an organization called Chefs Stopping AAPI Hate. And can you just talk about what that organization does? And you know, you've already kind of touched on like its origins, but why did you decide, you know, I want to actually create some sort of organization or foundation to address these issues?
Yeah, we kind of like fell onto it, right? So like my co-founder is Kevin Tien of Moon Rabbit here in Washington, D.C., another chef and a very talented chef. And we have just been friends for years. I mean, we've been restaurant adjacent, meaning our restaurants have always been close to each other. And so when all these things happened, we just happened to be on the phone, and it was just like, okay, this shit sucks. Right? Like watching all these videos looks like my mom, my dad, my grandma, or my grandpa getting pushed and like beaten up, and like on all these CCTV things that were like being shown all over on the news. And so we're like, you know, oh man, this sucks. Like, okay.
And then a president encouraging that behavior, right?
Oh yeah. Like that with all of his like anti-Asian sentiment and like Kung Flu and all that stuff, just like, you know, I don't want to say enraged, but like motivated a lot of things. And so the flip side is okay, hey, look, like we're chefs, you know, however, like you want to say like chefs of note or something like that. But like we have a platform. And with that platform, like there's a certain responsibility, like being like a community leader, we want to make sure that we use our platform, not just for like, you know, our businesses, but we want to use it for good. And so really that's where like deep down it just started. And so, you know, we put together a series of takeout dinners because we were in the pandemic and you couldn't eat in a restaurant, so you can only do takeout. So we're like, well, let's just embrace it. And we did these series of takeout dinners using Asian food as a way to like raise money for anti-Asian nonprofits, or sorry, anti-Asian hate nonprofits.
Yeah. It's a clumsy wording. You know, I always wanted like stopping Asian hate. What is it? You know, I like to Asian hate a lot of things. I don't necessarily want to stop it, but I understand. What fits in a hashtag sometimes is not always there.
I come on it all the time. But anyway, so like it became this takeout series that went from like one dinner to like 9 dinners here, and like 45 chefs that included Asian American chefs and non-Asian American chefs. And then that expanded to like 4 other cities. And then it really snowballed in terms of like what we were able to do. And we raised a significant amount of money to be able to donate to not only like national stopping Asian hate nonprofits, but also like we donated within the communities that we raised money from. We donated to much smaller nonprofits that were really on the ground and like affecting the community. So we wanted to make sure to do that as well.
So how did you land in Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. to be the base for your culinary career? You know, usually you think of like, again, New York or Chicago, like those are food cities. D.C. is, I mean, I think it's a great food city, but it's not, you know, the top of the list when people think of like great food cities around the country. How did you end up in DC?
Yeah, from Arkansas, I moved to New York. And really, we moved to New York because, like, for one, that's where my uncle's restaurant was. And so our family life revolved around this restaurant. My dad's parents happened to live there as well. We moved there in anticipation of them passing at the time. So we were like, okay, let's live there, be around the grandparents as much as we can before they pass. But like a lot of older Chinese people, they never died. They just like lived, they kept living on. And
that's the Ali Wong quote, right? Asians don't die.
Yeah, they don't. And so like we waited for like 3 years and they were just like still alive and kicking. And so we eventually ended up moving down to Virginia just because that's where like my dad was having the most success in the career that he was in. And so we actually ended up out there near you in where you grew up in Luray in Winchester in Stephen City.
Oh, wow.
So that was actually the first place that we moved because that's where my dad was working. And then slowly migrated to Northern Virginia, probably just like a lot of things as tech was moving into Northern Virginia, we moved over there and ended up, just in Northern Virginia. And that's where I spent my most formative years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I spent most of the time there and my parents actually still live in the same house to this day, 30 years later. And so it was only natural for me to like fall into like the area that I knew the best. Mm-hmm. And like, starting a restaurant is not an easy feat. And so even here is where I had the most support. And so, that is why I ended up here. But like during this time, again, like I feel very lucky, and a lot of the things that I've done in my life, restaurants and food in DC was becoming significant. Mm-hmm. I think now DC is one of the more, top 10 interesting food cities in America.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I just got lucky in folding into it. It wasn't like, I was like, I'm going there because I see the future of food in DC. It was, hey, all my friends are here. All my family let's stay close to home.
So do you feel a closer kinship? I mean, I guess like just looking at the totality of your life, you probably spent as much time in Virginia as you did in Arkansas, if not more, right?
Oh, like, much more, yeah.
Do you feel more of a kinship to Virginia as your home than Arkansas? Or is there still always a little bit of a Razorback in you? Is that what they are in Arkansas?
I mean, my dad still drives a car. My parents still drive cars with like Razorback, like decals on the thing.
Yeah.
And so, there's still like this Razorback like spirit within everybody. But yeah, I have much more of a kinship to Virginia just because like I said, all my formative time was spent here. All my obviously all my restaurants in my career as a chef and as an engineer was all spent in this area.
Mm-hmm. Normally we have a segment that ends every episode that asks our guests to think of a food memory. What is something that brings you back home? I guess in your case it would have been Arkansas, but as we established, it's Arkansas is more of a memory than a home. But so I wanted to actually flip this a little bit for you and ask you, what is your favorite American Chinese dish? Growing up, now, whatever, like however you want to interpret the question, but like if there was one like signature Chinese American dish, what is your favorite?
It's funny, I love crab rangoons. Like, I just love it, and like it's funny because it just has like no historical context other than like it's like the quintessential dish that shows the true nature of American Chinese cuisine and how dishes and Chinese food in America has become the way it's become. So yeah, I always love a good crab rangoon, though it's probably the most un-Chinese thing that you can pull off an American Chinese menu.
Follow up, do you prefer it with real crab meat or the imitation crab meat? Like what is the quintessential rangoon?
I have the most fantastic story about that. So like, when we started Lucky Danger, one of the things that I wanted to do was, and one thing ingrained in my nature as a chef was, okay, let's take the humble crab rangoon and let's chef it up, right? Let's make it nice. And so like typically the ingredients simply are imitation crab sticks chopped up with like cream cheese and like spices and scallions. And so like we took that and we're like, okay, like how do we make this like more like chefy or more fancy? And so we took it and we included like true Maryland crab because that's what we are known for in this area. And we took like crab roe and we folded that in to like enhance the flavor of crab. And so like typically as a chef, like fine dining, you want to take one flavor and you want to do it 10 different ways and then enhance. And so like that's kind of what we did. Imitation crab, real Maryland crab roe.
Oh, so you kept the imitation crab too?
Yeah, we kept the imitation crab in there, which probably, was just like a whole bunch of like fish bits.
Yeah.
And so we made the crab rangoon and we started to put it out there and we'd get like, it was the most polarizing thing on our menu. Like, oh my God, like this is the most crab rangoon I've ever had. Or you get the people who are used to crab rangoon and being like, it tastes funny. What the fuck is that? Like, it tastes weird. It tastes bad. Like, it tastes fishy. They're like, what is that weird flavor that you're putting in there? Because it's freaking terrible. And so finally, like, we were just like, oh my God, people don't like the flavor of crab in crab rangoon. Like, that's what it was. It was like, they're just like, this is disgusting. We're like, the crab that's in crab rangoon. And so finally, like, again, like the internet forces our hand to, we had to change it. We took all crab out of crab rangoon, and all of a sudden we're back to like, this is the most amazing thing. And so, yeah, like,
it's the cream cheese. That's what people want. People want the cream cheese. They don't want the crab.
Melty cream cheese and fake crab and like some sugar and some salt.
Some things just aren't meant to be elevated, dude. Like,
that's exactly what we landed on. And it was like this learning moment for the entire brand as a whole. It's like, sometimes you just don't fuck with things, and you move forward and fuck with other things.
Yeah. And
so that's exactly what's happening. It's to this day driven our ethos with some of the design of the dishes. We just really don't mess with some things.
Well, and I think that's why, I don't know if it's your motto, but I know that there's a saying on your store that says American Chinese food by Chinese Americans. And I think being Chinese American is what is able to allow you to do that, right? To decide which things need to be fucked with and which ones don't. I think being Chinese American, that's the only way you can fuck with American Chinese food. Because like, if some white dude came in and was like, let me elevate a crab rangoon, I would take offense to that. But that's the privilege of being Chinese American.
I think it also just helps in the perspective, right? So it's like, as we're forming these new dishes that are like kind of like more homely Chinese dishes, we lean on that experience of growing up around it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, we just grew up eating, shifan or like congee. And like, how do we start to fold that into the like American Chinese food diaspora? So it's really, I think it is a unique perspective on American Chinese food being Chinese American, rather than American Chinese by an American doesn't have the same ring to it.
Right. Or at the very least, I think to your point about being by Chinese American, also I think put some respect on it, right? Because it's Chinese American embracing American Chinese food. Because like what you started the conversation with about kind of running away from an identity, I feel like that's what a lot of it has to do when people are kind of reject American Chinese. It's almost like there's a shame or an embarrassment. Yeah. And I get that. It's like, everyone talks about the fucking lunchbox moment or whatever.
Yep.
But I think that there's an element of that when I hear like fellow Chinese Americans in particular kind of like clown it or talk bad about it. But I think what, the mission of your store is, and I think your ethos in general is just kind of like, again, respecting it, paying homage to it, but also moving it forward. Because again, you can't do the latter without the former.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I love that.
Tim, I'm so appreciative of the work that you do, and I'm so thankful that we're able to have this conversation. As you mentioned, the internet kind of drives a lot of what you do. How can people find you on said internet so they can talk shit about your crab rangoon?
Yeah, luckydanger.co, laobandumplings.com, Chefs Stopping AAPI Hate.com, or, just like Google Tim Mon, see all the awesome and bad internet stories about me.
Tim, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You can find me, Keith Chow, on Twitter at @TheRealChow, _real_Chow. Follow the podcast at Southern Asians on Twitter and at Southern Fried Asians on Instagram. Go to hardknockmedia.com to find this and all of the podcasts in the Hard Knock Media Network. Subscribe and download Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere you get podcasts. Support us on patreon.com/thenerdscolor. Also find us on GoFundMe. As always, Southern Fried Asian is co-produced by Jess Vu. Email us, thenerdscolor@gmail.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/thenerdscolor. And until next time, keep it Southern Fried, y'all.